Scotland is next on our list of who resisted the Vikings the best in Britain. Now, normally what I would like to do for the opening shot is to film on site. However, there is a bit of a problem. I live here in Worcester, and Scotland is all the way up here. Plus, if I wanted to go to a specific location, it's rather expensive to get to, especially with the current price of fuel. So instead, I bought this historical map of Scotland, which I'll put up in a moment. Ta-da! And if you'd like to support a Scottish film and trip one day, you can by becoming a Patreon member or YouTube channel member. Scotland during the Viking Age is similar to England in how the Vikings played a significant role in the development of these kingdoms. Yet again, as we're in the early Middle Ages, especially for Scotland, there's not so many diverse sources of information. So to explain how well Scotland resisted the Vikings, I'll be using a variety of different sources, some Irish sources, some English sources, and of course some Scottish sources. Now we do have a Scottish source that explains how Scotland came to be. This is from the Chronicles of the Kings of Alba, 850 to 975 AD. Alba is just another name for the Kingdom of Scotland, but just in Scottish Gaelic. So Kenneth, son of Alpin, first of the Scots, ruled this Pictland prosperously for 16 years. Pictland was named after the Picts, whom, as we have said, Kenneth destroyed, for God deigned to make them alien from, and void of, their heritage, by reason of their wickedness, because they not only spurned the Lord's mass and precepts, but also refused to be held equal to others in the law of justice. 2 years before he came to Pictland, he had received the kingdom of Dalriada. There's a few issues here. One, this chronicle is written much later, in the late Middle Ages, but the reason I've quoted it is it's a source directly related and composed in Scotland. Secondly, this is a typical medieval chronicler talking about a displaced or conquered people. The whole line "they deserved it because they were sinners" crops up in many other medieval chroniclers, for example Gerald of Wales talking about the Irish, or any other chronicle that mentions why the Welsh deserved to be conquered by Edward I. How the Picts were, quote, destroyed is more complex than what the chronicle is saying. I'm not going to dwell on this for too long, as I want to move on to Vikings in Scotland. To give a summarised version, the Scotti were a tribe that had moved from the north of Ireland into what is now Scotland in the early 6th century, around Argyll. Eventually the kingdom of Dalriada would emerge or form from other smaller petty kingdoms, and they either coexisted with Pictland or the occasional fighting between each kingdom's nobility. However, what really drove these kingdoms to merge were the Vikings. So let's start the timeline of Viking activity in Scotland, the first recorded one being in 794 from the Annals of Ulster. Devastation of all the islands of Britain by Gentiles. I know I quoted this in the England video, but it is the first recorded attack. However, for something more specific to Scotland, the burning of Rathlin by Gentiles, and Skye was pillaged and devastated. The Isle of Skye is one of the islands in the Inner Hebrides. As I mentioned in the England episode about geography, Scotland has a lot and larger island around its mainland, the Inner and Outer Hebrides, the Shetland Isles and the Orkney Isles, and these islands would become excellent bases and later settlements for the Norse, to which a unique culture and kingdom would emerge from, but we'll get to that later. In fact, the next location that gets raided by the Norse in 798 is the Hebrides again, but then during the early part of the 9th century, there's a lull from the sources until 825, where the monk Blathmac is killed by the Norse after he refused to reveal where the rich goods were. The island of Iona in the Inner Hebrides is the location of one of Scotland's most important culturally significant abbeys, and also might be the oldest, with its foundations dating back to the 6th century. It's on the same level of importance for Scotland as Lindisfarne is for England, which made it a rich target for the pagan Vikings. The fate of Blathmac is explained in his tale, which is rather long, so I'll just quote the juicy part. There he spoke to thee, barbarian, in words such as these: I know nothing at all of the gold you seek, where it is placed in the ground, or what in hiding place it is concealed. And if by Christ's permission it were granted me to know it, never would our lips relate it to thy ears. Barbarian, draw thy sword, grasp the hilt, and slay, gracious God, to thy aid I commend me humbly. Therefore the pious sacrifice was torn limb from limb. I think the Vikings were the perfect villains for Christianity and its weird fetish for martyrdom. Although in this case, the killing of Blathmac isn't as well known as, say, King Edmund of East Anglia, but it's the first death of a Scottish clergyman who would later become a saint. The Abbey of Iona would be raided quite a number of times by the Norse over the course of the Viking Age, that eventually at some point it was abandoned for a time. And to show you on this map, Iona is just here. Now we come to the year 839 and how it became a pivotal year for the development of the Scottish kingdom, as in the first reference I mentioned at the start of the video from the Chronicle of the Kings of Alba in how Scotland came to be. While in 839 AD, a major battle occurred that changed how the Kingdom of Pictland and Dalriada would form to become Scotland, from the Annals of Ulster. A battle was fought by the Gentiles against the men of Pictland, and in it fell Eoganan, Angus' son, and Bran, Angus' son, and Ede, Boatan's son, and others fell, almost without number. So in one battle, the dynasty of one of the kingdoms that would make up Scotland are wiped out by the Norse. This gives us some clues on how Scotland was formed, but also gives us many questions about the fate of the Kingdom of the Picts and Dalriada. For example, the location, the numbers, the actions of the Norse army after the battle. This catastrophic loss to the Norse gave rise to Kenneth MacAlpin, who I mentioned near the start of the video in the Chronicle of the Kings of Alba. Kenneth is a rather difficult figure to research, as many different chronicles give differing information about him, mainly where exactly he came from and which kingdoms he ruled. For example, the Chronicles of the Kings of Alba mention that he ruled for 16 years, but then another chronicle states that Alpin was killed in Galloway after he had entirely destroyed and devastated it, and then the kingdom of the Scots was transferred to the kingdom of the Picts. The same conflicting information occurs in a few other chronicles. Regardless, it seems that Kenneth became High King of Scotland, perhaps chosen because of the danger of the Norse attacks, as by at least 850 AD, the Vikings had begun to settle and establish bases all across the Inner and Outer Hebrides, Orkney Isles and the Shetland Isles, plus the Isle of Man. Kenneth would fight the Norse and in some chronicles, the Picts. By 853, the relics located on Iona were transferred to Ireland. However, Ireland was also suffering from major Viking attacks and settlements. One Norse leader rises to prominence in our sources, Olaf the White. Olaf, son of the king of the White Scandinavians, came to Ireland, and the Scandinavians of Ireland submitted to him, and tribute was given to him by the Gaels. Strigurd and Ivar, his two full brothers, came with him on that expedition. So when the sources in Ireland mention white or black Gentiles or Scandinavians, it means white for the Norwegians and black for the Danes. The Gaels mean for Scotland and Irish settlers in Scotland. But for the Scandinavians, they would fight each other in Ireland and Scotland. But Olaf the White appears in the Chronicles of the Kings of Alba. And after 2 years, Olaf with his Gentiles wasted Pictland and dwelt in it from January 1st to March 17th. The theme continues for Scotland, with many raids conducted by the various Norse factions during the 860s. One example, in 866, Olaf and Orgysel went into Pictland with the foreigners of Ireland and Scotland. and they raided all the lands of the Picts and took hostages from them. The 860s are not a really great time to be in Britain. Scotland is getting raided, the English kingdoms are dealing with the Great Heathen Army, Olaf the White was a real menace for Ireland and Scotland. In one account, he sails back and forth from Ireland and Scotland with 200 ships, with many different captives, some Anglo-Saxon, some Scottish, some Irish, some Strathclyde, etc. Ireland was a hub of commercial market activity for the Scandinavians, and Scotland was quite easy for the Norse to get there from Ireland. However, by the end of the 870s, Olaf the White is never mentioned again in the chronicles. But the historical figures from this time period dip and dive out of the sources all the time, so it's not uncommon. The Scottish kings themselves in this period are really difficult to track as well. King Constantine is mentioned as having slain a Viking leader who led over 100 ships. But then in 875, the Chronicle of the Kings of Alba and the Annals of Ulster both mention a major battle of significance. A battle was fought by him, Constantine, in his 14th year, 875, at Dollar between Danes and Scotti, and the Scotti was slain and driven to Atholl. The Northmen spent a whole year in Pictland, and the Annals of Ulster in the same battle. The Picts encountered the Dark Foreigners in battle, and a great slaughter of the Picts resulted. So now that we're coming towards the end of the 9th century for Viking Age Scotland, let's review how it's going. Not great. The numerous raids conducted by the Norse had forced many communities to abandon or relocate. Powerful Norse sea kings were consolidating their power in Scotland and Ireland. However, the Scots are holding firm, even after losing King Constantine in battle against the Norse. The date of his death in battle isn't clear. Numerous different sources give the date of his death sometime after 875. Here's one on his death. Constantine became king for 15 years. He was the son of King Kenneth. Fighting in battle, he fell by the arms of the Danes. The place where the battle was fought is called Black Cave. Regardless of how he died in battle or what year, a king of Scotland was slain by the Norse. But this was not the end of the Kingdom of Scotland. Unlike the Kingdom of Northumbria, who lost 2 kings in one battle, Scotland would continue to endure despite many more Norse attacks during the 10th century, as a Norse kingdom would emerge on the many isles around mainland Scotland, the Kingdom of the Isles, consisting of the Inner and Outer Hebrides, the Orkney and Shetland Isles. This kingdom would exist in various states until 1266 in the late Middle Ages. We're a long way off that, as we're only in the 900s at the moment. But this gives me the opportunity to introduce a source that is incredibly fun to read. The Orkney Saga. Largely composed in the 13th century, and the Norse sagas are rather known for their storytelling rather than their accuracy. But the Orkney Saga is still an important resource as it focuses on the islands around Scotland. If you have the time, I'd highly suggest on reading the Orkney Saga. This version I'm holding is a more modern translation, however there are free versions to read online. This extract from the Orkney Saga explains how important the saga is for Scottish history. The saga creates vivid, though sometimes tantalizingly hazy pictures of the islands at a time when they were still part of the Viking world, and both culturally and politically closer to Norway than Scotland, so that the narrative invites people of Orkney and Shetland to recognise themselves as the inheritors and custodians of a dual culture, both Norse and Scottish. As for the actual sagas, it explains how the Kingdom of the Isles was formed. One summer, Harald Finehair sailed west over the North Sea in order to teach a lesson to certain Vikings whose plundering he could no longer tolerate. These Vikings used to raid in Norway over the summer and had Shetland and Orkney as their winter base. Harald conquered Shetland, Orkney and the Hebrides, then sailed all the way to the Isle of Man, where he laid its settlement in ruin. During his campaign, he fought a number of battles, winning himself territories further west than any king of Norway had done since. In one of these battles, Earl Rognvold's son Ivar was killed. On his way back to Norway, King Harald gave the Earl Shetland and Orkney in compensation for his son, but the Earl gave all the islands to his brother, Sigurd, the forecastle man on King Harold's ship. When the king sailed back east, he gave Sigurd the title of Earl, and Sigurd stayed on in the islands. So now I've given some background to how the Kingdom of the Isles might have formed. The Scots were encompassed by the Norse from nearly all sides, but still resisting well enough. Before I resume the timeline of Viking activity in Scotland, as I did with the previous episode on explaining the ships of the Norse, for this video I want to explain the trade of the Norse in this period of history in Scotland. Especially now we're at the point where the Norse are settling and trading in Scotland, which leads us to what are they trading in? What resources were on the Isles of Scotland that the Norse were trading across Europe? This is where we can turn to archaeology to help us out. And from one paper explains how interconnected the islands were with the rest of Europe. The Scottish Isles became important in the Norse world as staging points at the crossroad of the Irish Sea, North Sea, and Atlantic Ocean. Medieval merchants from Dublin, York, and Bergen would have stopped in the Northern and Western Isles on their way across the North Atlantic to trade in Iceland and Greenland. As for trade goods, this Shetlandic Norwegian trade seems to have been concentrated on basic raw materials and commodities, whose production entails relatively little labour, such as stockfish, i.e. air-dried cod, timber, and cereals. One major resource that was imported and exported to and from the Isles was soapstone, used in many kinds of material goods, as there were many soapstone quarries during the Viking Age in Scotland. Quote, within Shetland, there is evidence of the use of several quarries. The production probably declined by the end of the 14th century in response to increasing imports of ceramics, and thereafter, production probably continued only for a smaller domestic market. So the trading of goods and resources were vital to the economic growth of these now Norse Isles. And with such growth, more elaborate and important buildings were constructed. As with these settlements established, and by the later centuries when the Norse became Christian and these isles were connected to a bishopric, bishops were rich men, and one item that is connected with the Scandinavian influence on the Isles are the Lewis chess pieces. A fantastic historical set of chess pieces found on the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides, carved from a variety of animal bone and tusks. I think the chess pieces are a great example of the mixture of cultures between the Scandinavian peoples and the Scottish. This is a replica that I have bought off Vinted because a Lewis chess piece in its full set would cost over hundreds of pounds. So I bought these. They were only about a tenner. Quite good. Moving back to the timeline as we're entering the 10th century, it's still not looking great for Scotland. Donald, Constantine's son, held the kingdom for 11 years. The Northmen wasted Pictland at this time. There's also some mention of a Norse-Irish settlement in Galloway in southern Scotland, as some of the Irish sources, namely the Annals of Ulster, mentions names listed as kings, but again, there's not much else from the sources. One of our secondary sources, Viking Empires, mentions this issue with Galloway in the 10th century. The political relationships between these areas of the Gallgad Hill settlement, stretching from the inner Clyde estuary to the inner Solway zone and the Kingdom of Strathclyde to its north and east, are obscure in the extreme. But moving back to the whole of medieval Scotland in the 10th century, we unfortunately get to another Scottish king killed by the Norse, Donald II, and this is from the Chronicles of the Kings of Alba. In his reign, a battle occurred between Danes and Scots at Innisallen. The Scots had victory. He was killed at Dunorta by the Gentiles. So the Norse have killed a number of Scottish kings. Yet the next King of Scotland would rule the kingdom for over 40 years, which is unprecedented in Scottish history, but even more so for this time period in the Middle Ages, as some of the best kings in Britain didn't even come close to ruling for that long, and his name is fitting for a king that had ruled for as long as he did. Constantine II. Now, I've hyped up his introduction, so you might be thinking, wow, we finally have a Scottish king that we have loads of historical information on and how he dealt with the Norse. We don't, sadly. Constantine's historical record is woefully incomplete. This also coincides with that Ireland also experienced a lull in Norse attacks and raids for some time from 877 to 917, according to the Wars of the Irish with the foreigners. It's also worth noting that by the 10th century, there's many different factions of the Vikings, as I mentioned before with the white and black Gentiles, but also generations have passed, so integrating with Ireland and Scotland, creating other types of Norse hybrids mentioned in the Irish sources, which are our main source of information for Scotland in this period. Also, Constantine is mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles in the 10th century. Constantine's reign alongside Viking activities mentioned in the Chronicles of the Kings of Alba are, and in his third year, the Northmen plundered Dunkeld and all Alba. In the following year, the Northman was slain in Strathern. That's it. So again, we turn to the Irish sources. Once again, the 12th century chronicles, Wars of the Irish with the Foreigners, mentions in 918, the foreigners of Waterford went from Ireland to Scotland after that, and the men of Scotland gave them battle, and they were slain there, namely Ronald and Otter. This victory for the Scots is substantial, as the battle is mentioned in other chronicle accounts, in which they gush about the Scottish victory due to their faith in God against the heathens. Typical medieval chronicler praise there. But the victory for the Scots did stem the tide of Norse raids, as there's no mention of any further attacks, or at least any significant ones recorded. And reading from the Orkney Saga, it seems that the Scots were able to intervene in the power struggles of the Kingdom of the Isles. Halfdan Long-Legged arrived in Orkney, and when the news got around that one of King Harald's sons had turned up, it frightened everyone. Some of the people offered him allegiance, but Earl Einard fled the islands over to Scotland. Halfdan conquered the islands and set himself up as king over them. Later in the year, however, Einard came back to fight him, and though the battle was fierce, Einard came out as victor. If the Kingdom of Scotland couldn't subjugate or conquer the Kingdom of the Isles, it could at least have a friendly ally ruling there, as by 920 there was an emerging power in the south of Britain that was conquering the Viking settled lands south of Scotland, the Kingdom of Wessex, led by Edward the Elder. As the Chronicle of Melrose and the Anglo-Saxon chronicles both mention, the King of Scots and most of the other kings of Britain giving homage to Edward or swore to him as their father. But by 927, the Kingdom of Wessex had transformed from the combination of other southern kingdoms and the Danish settled lands into the Kingdom of England, led by Edward's son and successor, King Aethelstan. This new king wasted no time in getting submissions via military force. He conquered in battle and put to flight the King of the Britons, and Constantine, King of the Scots, and Owen, King of Gwent, and they asked peace from him and made a treaty with, confirmed by an oath. The idea that two Christian nations, such as England and Scotland, not working together to expel the heathen Norse from Britain, shows how complex the political matters were, regardless of faith. as Aethelstan would be back in Scotland in 934 with both a land and naval army, wasting across the kingdom. According to one source, due to Constantine having broken the oath or breaking the peace. It might have been the case that Aethelstan wanted to reinforce previous agreements, or that he wanted to be the master of Britain. Regardless of the reasons, Constantine was at a loss, and according to John of Worcester's account, Constantine gave his son over to Aethelstan as a hostage. Now where the Vikings come into this is in 937. The Scots, the Britons of Strathclyde, and the Irish Norse, led by the King of Dublin, Olaf, invaded England. However, they were defeated at the Battle of Brunanburh, and Constantine lost one of his sons in the battle. There's so much missing background context and questions leading up to this battle. 1. Being allied with a pagan king. 2. Did they ever meet in person to discuss strategy and coordination? So many questions we can't answer. However, Constantine would later give up the crown and retire to a monastery. A somewhat happy ending for a Scottish king who had ruled Scotland for over 40 years. As for Viking activity in the later 10th century, the Hebrides were again raided. Factions within the Kingdom of the Isles would be fighting amongst themselves again. A Viking fleet was defeated in the 950s/960s, but the chronicles seem preoccupied with two branches of the Scottish nobility fighting each other for the crown. The Scots had a terrible habit of fighting amongst themselves. I've covered later Scottish kings named James, who were unlucky to rule Scotland in the later Middle Ages, if you want to go and watch that video. Back to Viking activity. One battle that would directly affect Viking activity in Scotland happened in Ireland, the Battle of Tara in 980, in which the many kings in Ireland joined forces and routed the Vikings out of Dublin. While not the complete end of Viking attacks for Ireland, it was a major victory, meaning that Scotland would see a reprieve of attacks from the Norse. As we're approaching the end of the 10th century, we're now at a point where the term heathens isn't really going to work for the Vikings, as by the 11th century, the Christianization of Scandinavia is well underway, and in the settled Scandinavian lands as well. But for the Norse in Scotland, from one tale in the Orkney saga, the ruler of the Isles, Sigurd the Stout, was forced to convert to Christianity. King Olaf sailed east with 5 ships, and didn't break his journey until he reached Orkney. As Osmundwall, he ran into Earl Sigurd, who had 3 ships and was setting out on a Viking expedition. Olaf sent a messenger to him, asking Sigurd to come over to his ship as he wanted a word with him. "I want you and all your subjects to be baptized," he said when they met. "If you refuse, I'll have you killed on the spot, and I swear that I'll ravage every island with fire and steel." The Earl could see what kind of situation he was in, and surrendered himself into Olaf's hands. He was baptized, and Olaf took his son as a hostage, and had him baptized too. After that, all Orkney embraced the faith. And again, we can turn to our friend archaeology for information on Viking conversion to Christianity. Quote, "Past archaeological excavations, directed by Christopher Morris, focused on the area around the partially upstanding stone chapel. Under it was discovered the remains of an earlier timber chapel, predating a layer containing an Anglo-Saxon coin of Edgar, minted between AD 959 and 975. This chapel is thus among the earliest known evidence for Viking Age Christianity in the Scandinavian North Atlantic region, possibly predating the traditional conversion date of AD 995. So there's some indication that by the end of the 10th century, the Scandinavians in Scotland were becoming Christian, which raises further questions for the Vikings in Scotland. When do we stop referring to them as Vikings and instead as their nation-sakes? The kingdoms of Denmark, Norway and Sweden are well established by the start of the 11th century. Plus they're now Christian, so ideally they wouldn't raid Christian sites. Instead, the nature of how Scotland dealt with its immediate issues with the kingdoms of the Isles was with marriage, a classic tactic used in the Middle Ages, but also the now major threat from the Kingdom of England, which in 1016 was conquered by a Viking ruler, Canute, who in 1027 took an army to Scotland and re-established what previous Anglo-Saxon kings of England had done to the Scots, forcing a submission, which was always loosely ignored. The major problem is ending the Viking Age in Britain. Typically in England, it's considered in the year 1066, with the death of the King of Norway, Harald Hardrada, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. However, that's England, not Scotland. The Kingdom of the Isles still existed in 1066 and is later subjected to the Norwegian Kingdom. So when do we end the Viking Age? Well, one of our sources, Viking Empires, mentions this. There are many dates given for the end of the Viking Age. English historians end it around the time of the Norman conquest in 1066. Danish historians see the end as coming in 1085, when King Canute IV had assembled an invasion fleet of thousands of ships off the coast of Jutland, but he had to abort the invasion attempt because his father-in-law, Count Robert of Flanders, did not supply the invasion army that Canute and the Danish expected. In Scotland, Scandinavian earls continued to rule the islands and some of the mainland for hundreds of years. They were driven from the mainland in the mid-12th century, but remained in the northern islands for another 300 years. The latest date for the end of the Viking Age is thus the one used by Scottish historians, who date it to the Battle of Largs, 1263, and the subsequent Treaty of Perth, 1266. The historian accounts all have one thing in common. They have focused on a single military event which has been taken as a convenient breaking point off for the Scandinavian dominion of a large part of Europe. But the traditional account leaves an open question. Why did the Scandinavians not bounce back? Why did the Norwegians not regroup to take England after 1066? Why was Canute IV's invasion attempt of 1085 not successful? And why was it not followed by other attempts? The answer lies in a more subtle approach to the end of the Viking Age. It did not go out with a bang, most historians like to see, but rather with an apparent whimper. It is not possible to ascribe a single reason to the end of the Viking Age. Instead, a number of factors combine to change the Scandinavian outlook to one that was more in line with the rest of Europe. This process was drawn out over 2 centuries and was inextricably bound with the contemporary developments across Europe, in particular with the social and ecclesiastical reforms of the High Middle Ages. But by the end of this process, the Viking threat to Western Europe had been transformed into the Scandinavian kingdoms that formed a crucial part of the Great Common European Project, the Crusades. So how well did Scotland resist the Vikings? Pretty well, considering the amount of attacks and attempts at conquering Scotland. While the Isles might have fallen, most of mainland Scotland held out, and even fought back, even if it took centuries, until 1266 with the Treaty of Perth. But the Scots were never conquered by the Norse, unlike England. So Scotland can go into the B category for bloody hell, that was tough. I would also add that the kingdoms of England and Scotland by the end of the 11th century had developed alongside the Vikings to not only resist them, but also adapt alongside them. Coupled with the conversion of the Scandinavians to Christianity, the Norse was so important in how England and Scotland evolved, even if the Vikings were superseded by their now French Norse-speaking cousins. Without the Vikings, England and Scotland would be very different. Now for the final episode, we'll look at how the Welsh resisted the Vikings. Thank you all for watching, and do all the things, like, share, hype, etc. I'll see you later on the next episode.